Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on the Akal and Coca report. Our guest today is physician and author Sally Satel. Dr. Satel is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and a staff psychiatrist at a methadone clinic in the Washington, D.C. area. She earned a bachelor's degree from Cornell University, a master's degree from the University of Chicago, and an MD degree from Brown University. She has written widely in academic journals on topics related to psychiatry and medicine, and she's published articles on cultural aspects of medicine and science in numerous magazines and journals. She has testified before Congress on veterans issues, mental health policy, drug courts, and health disparities. And she's the author of numerous books, including The Health Disparities Myth, Diagnosing the Treatment Gap with co-author Jonathan Click, and most recently, Brainwashed, the seductive appeal of mindless neuroscience, co-authored with Scott Lilienfeld. Sally, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Great to have you. So Sally, a few weeks ago, we had our colleague, Dr. John Mandrola on the show because he's a well-known figure in the world of cardiology and medicine in general. He's got a very large following on Twitter. He has a podcast, he has a regular column where he comments on medical issues. And he had the audacity of publicly expressing his agreement with an article that you had published. And in response to that, he was essentially, the Twitter mob went after him. and he had to fend. He said he had never experienced that in his life on social media. And so, we had him on, but then we thought, we should have you on to tell us about this very controversial article that you wrote. So I'll have the article on the show notes. The title of it is The Hippocratical Oath. And to set the stage, I will read just the first couple of paragraphs, okay, of the article. Here we go. There have been a growing number of calls for doctors to make the fight against racism central to what they do. The American Board of Internal Medicine, for example, recently decried, quote, structural, systemic, and cultural racism. Meanwhile, the American Academy of Pediatrics has implored its members to, quote, dismantle racism at every level of society. Their logic is straightforward. Living in a racist society and being exposed to racist police violence is bad for the health of Black Americans. Doctors should thus do three things: increase diversity within the medical profession, improve their understanding of the social determinants of health, and contend with broad social issues that impact health in a less direct manner. What's wrong with this, Dr. Satel?
Well, I agree with 66% of it. I think the first two mandates make perfect sense, which is to expand, have as an inclusive profession as we can while maintaining standards of excellence, and using affirmative action in the traditional sense of outreach and finding talented people who might not otherwise think of medicine as a profession. And I certainly agree with teaching about social determinants. I do think that there is probably not, well, at least when I was in training, gosh, in the 80s, probably not enough emphasis on context, social context. And in psychiatry, you might imagine that is one of the areas that probably pediatrics are where the context, the social and family and community context is most manifest. So certainly the context is very important, and that's what really social determinants of health come down to. So that's of course important, and that is a robust and rigorous field of research. And then there's a subtext of a subset of that called, I think, social. I'm blanking on the name, but basically, if social determinants is kind of the academic part in terms of understanding what these various variables may may interact. And we see this in COVID as a beautiful example of it, as to why minorities are more afflicted. It's just because circumstances of their lives, it just on average are such that their employment situations are such that they have to interact with the public during this time, and they have to take public transportation. They often live in, or more often than majority white communities, live in multi-generational households, which can increase the exposure. So all these are social determinants of why of infectiousness for COVID, for example. I was alluding then to a subset of that, which is, well, what's called structural competence, I believe, which is the idea that, well, maybe we can even influence some of these determinants to affect health, and exploring that. But then there's a third. Now I come to the 1/3 of that triad you mentioned earlier, which is where I wrote, contend with broad social issues that impact health in a less direct manner. And of course, dismantling, which I say with air quotes, because that's now almost a term of art, dismantling racism is one of them. While I think almost everyone would endorse such a project, at least in theory, because sometimes it's not it's hard to define. It's sort of a slippery concept, but the question then becomes, what can doctors do about that? And that's really the entree into, I suppose, what some people find controversial. But honestly, I read some of the comments on Dr. Mandrola's Twitter, which is more expansive than mine, so he managed to get more of the blowback than I did. But I actually agreed with a lot of the points that people made. Again, that we should pay attention to these determinants, and that we should try to increase diversity within the professions. So I agree with all that, but I do have significant questions about how broad can doctors go? How far beyond our expertise and beyond the orbit of care can we really go?
Okay, so was there anything in particular that prompted you to write this article? Because you actually mentioned a few developments, changes in the curriculum that are happening, or proposals and whatnot. So do you recall? I mean, was there anything?
Yeah, well, I've been following I wrote a book in 2000, so long ago now it seems, or maybe it came out in 2001, but it was called PCMD, How Political Correctness is Corrupting Medicine. That's a long time ago. So, but I've been interested in the interface of medicine and science and culture, and how political agendas from the right and the left affect science and healthcare. So this is a longstanding interest of mine, and I'm very concerned about compromising our standards as physicians, and about specific ideologies and politics, not even so much influence, but I would say distorting what we do, because we don't live in a vacuum. Of course, it's going to politics, and again, as I mentioned before, context. It always affects what we do. But what concerns me is when it distorts facts, and when it distorts the facts and the communication of those facts, and leads to policies that are counterproductive. That's really, a problem.
Right.
So yes, in the case you mentioned specifically, some of the curriculum changes that seem to be a number of medical schools are already undergoing, in terms of teaching about quote unquote anti-racism. There are several levels at which one can question this. One is this just the most productive use of time for busy trainees who have so much to learn? Another question is, how well would it be done? I mean, I would certainly love to have a course in medical, or at least a few, seminar sessions on quality medical sociology. But the way it's often written about is, again, with such an ideological stance, And with the readings from people like Robin DiAngelo, white fragility, which is not an academic approach to this at all. In fact, it's a patently illogical approach to the at least one facet of race, because one of her central points is that you're racist, but you don't know it, and if you protest or if you are resistant to this notion that you are, then of course that is evidence that you are. I mean, it's a disprovable kind of proposition. It's patently illogical, and that is not to say that some people may well have kinds of unexamined biases, and I mean bias in the most in the most neutral OED sense of the word, a leaning, a predisposition, an assumption. That might be wrong, and they should be more introspective and have a lower threshold for questioning these assumptions, and even maybe a threshold for wondering whether something is even an assumption. But again, these are not works of dispassionate scholarship by
Right.
historians.
Yet you mentioned in your piece, so that you say Stanford University School of Medicine, for example, has published an anti-racist curriculum, which instructs students in, quote, confronting white supremacy, unquote. The University of California at San Francisco offers a toolkit for, quote, anti-racism and race literacy, which emphasizes, again, white privilege, and recommends this book by Robin DiAngelo, White Fragility. The Association of American Medical Colleges wants schools to administer, quote, unconscious bias training, unquote.
Right.
Michigan Governor Gretchen. So I mean, I see what you're saying, but at the same time, I think these are academic institutions.
Right, they are, and they're not behaving that way. Implicit
Right.
bias, for anyone who's examined the literature, and it is robust at this point, because the implicit association test, which is how one measures implicit bias, has been effectively, or I should say the race version of the IAT, the implicit association test, has been debunked in terms of its predictive value. It says nothing about how one will behave in the real world. And which is not to say implicit bias doesn't exist. In fact, most of our cognitive life may be implicit, but
Right.
so it's not debunking this concept that people, again, but as a test in an institution and a whole, fallacious pedagogy that's emanated from this, it's really bankrupt.
Right. So to give a context,
right?
To give a context to the audience about this implicit bias training, because some in the audience may not be aware, I would say maybe 15, 20 years ago, there were psychological tests designed. One of the principal proponents of these tests is a psychologist named cognitive psychologist Brian Nosek. We actually had him on the show about a couple of years ago.
Oh, he's excellent. Yeah.
So he, so these tests that purported to show that unconsciously we make decisions that affect what we do and that affect the way we view others, differences and so forth, and particularly have been applied, as you mentioned, to interracial relationships and so forth, and has become sort of the main arguments, the main development, at least in the last 10, 15 years, to promote the idea that there is structural racism that is rampant, that we're not aware of it, that we do things, and therefore that we ought to tackle it by these implicit bias trainings, because now there are, to counteract that, you can go through training seminars that will make you aware of your implicit biases and but you're right that that's a lot of that has been called into question
by Brian Nosek.
Right, by Brian Nosek himself.
Yes, that's why I have so much respect for him.
Right. So, but that's something that's at least seems to have, despite the protestations of Brian Nosek, seems to continue to have a lot of purchase in academic circles. In the and to give an example of how that works out, The New England Journal of Medicine, the premier medical journal in the U.S., I would say, probably in the world in terms of impact, has had has continually articles on these questions of racism and anti-racism. Just to give an example, some headlines in the last few weeks of opinion pieces, if you will, that they've published. September 22, The Path Forward, an anti-racist approach to academic medicine. September 17, Am I Racist? September 10, The Performance of Anti-Racism Curricula. September 3, Taking Black Pain Seriously, and so forth, and it goes on and on. The one piece that I read titled "Am I Racist?" that is precisely it's the story of coming, the coming to realization of a physician that after taking one of these implicit bias tests, that he all of a sudden, it dawned on him that yes, he was racist. He took the test twice. The test gave him the answer that he was racist, and that he came to realize that, and sort of it's an interesting interesting position to take, because traditionally racism is a very overt and conscious position that people take, right? I mean, it's racism.
Well, that's one of the things.
It's supposed to be what you believe. You believe that you're superior because you're of that race or this race, and that the others are not as good and undeserving and so forth.
Well, that's a traditional, but yeah, I think that's how people of, I'll just say our generation, do tend to think about it, almost at a personal level or interpersonal level. Like, I have these attitudes about you that are unfounded or harsh, based solely on your race, or I treat you differently than someone else solely because of your race. Of course, now it's taken on, and that's why I think it's so important for people to define. I wish we'd even use the R words anymore and just say, what do you mean? Do you mean a system that is somehow constructed so that even if the people within it don't harbor any conscious animus, that they still end up performing in ways that disadvantage one group? Just be more precise. But that's the note. That's the general behind conscious bias, again, within the individual and systemic within the system. But back to the IAT that this doctor took. He didn't even interpret it. I mean, God bless him. You could hear the man flagellating himself while you're reading the article. He just wants to do the right thing. And again, I think this introspection on balance is healthy, although in his case, I think it went a little too far. And what I mean by that is when you look at one of the explanations for why one might be, and I'm just going to, again, can't hear the air quotes, see the air quotes on the podcast, but air quotes, I rated, R-A-T-E-D, I rated racist on this test. That means, I think there are 3 gradations, mild, moderate, and severe, of millisecond differences in length of, in latency of reaction to pairing of positive words with white or black faces, or this kind of thing. And those latencies, are real. Sometimes they're not that stable, which is to say a person could take the test in the morning and rate kind of high on that gradation, and then the next, and take it the next day and rate 0 difference or low. It seems that this doctor rated the same both times. Okay, so maybe that makes it a little more meaningful, a little more reliable. But what could it mean? Well, it could mean anything. It could mean that that's just it could actually even mean when you react more quickly or more slowly, it doesn't necessarily reflect a sort of a dislike or some sort of disregard for someone. In fact, it could actually mean the opposite, that you're even more attuned to the distress that you associate with a group or their disadvantage. And that accounts for the difference in response. There are other explanations. He, of course, was sensitized to interpreting it as, this must mean I'm racist. But ultimately, where does the rubber meet the road in the clinic? And everything this doctor described himself doing. This was, I believe, a case of a young man who I don't recall his medical condition, but basically he was in a comatose state from which he would unlikely recover, right? And the prognosis was terrible. And he had explained to the family, this was an African-American family, he'd done every responsible thing someone could do. And the family was hostile to him. And you can imagine a million reasons why a family would be in so much distress that they would be hostile to a Black physician. We can never do the counterfactuals in these cases. But in any case, there seemed to be some distrust, I think expressed by the grandmother. And it could have been because he was white, it is possible. But there's just so much he could control. He did everything it seemed he could. And I think at the end, he felt a little better when he kind of reviewed his behavior. But, these are just tragedies. And I think he was way too hard on himself. As I said before, 2 times already, I mean, we should question ourselves probably more than maybe we have been, but I think he showed the excesses of that sort of examination.
Right. It's interesting, when we had Brian Nosek on, we talked primarily about his discovery that a lot of the statistical tools that are used to validate all of these tests, it turns out that, there are a lot of possible ways of applying the, statistical theory to sort of sort out all of that stuff. And many of the people who design those tests and who go into the, that particular field to study that, I mean, as you can imagine, they may themselves have their own sort of, in fact, explicit view of, what the test should, what kind of results the test should lead to, and that sort of thing. And so it really gives one spot. It gives one pause when you think that all of much of the claim being made now that is, there's a huge push is primarily from these implicit bias tests that people, all of a sudden they realize that, oh my God, I'm racist. I didn't know it. I thought I was a good person.
But following up on what,
go ahead, Anisha.
To follow up on what Michelle is saying, and to kind of come back to your article, which it's trying to draw a line between politics and medicine. Do you think that it's possible for science to be apolitical? Do you think it's possible for science to be value neutral?
I think that people come to questions because of, it could well be that they formulate their questions, based on personal or policy interests. But I think if you organize your research team well, you can build in a lot of checks and balances against designing the questions, asking a good question, designing the experiment or the study well, and then interpreting it as reasonably as you can, and elaborating several. If there are more than one interpretation, go various ways, and then propose subsequent experiments that can help you narrow down these various interpretations. How could we further refine what explains this? So I think that people are motivated to ask questions, based on interests and preferences and maybe even biases. But I think there are ways to build in protections so that the data collection, the questions asked, the methodologies, and the interpretations are as fair-minded as possible.
It seems like that's easier in certain fields than others, or in certain areas of interest than others. So when you're talking about what the best antibiotic is for a certain pneumonia, you can come up with an experiment that will hopefully arrive at something, regardless of whether the person doing the experiment or the person doing the interpreting voted for Donald Trump or is going to vote for Joe Biden. Do you think that's possible in the social sciences? So, for instance,
Well,
in the type of question that the Brian Nosek, amazing guy, really love his work, and he's one of the few really objective folks who really questions his own biases and stuff. And it's so hard to do. But Brian Nosek's question that he gave, he had a data set of a soccer league where a bunch of red cards were handed out, penalties that were handed out by various different referees to various different players. And he had this large data set that he gives to 20 different teams. And the question are the red cards being given out? Is there racism there or not? That type of question, it seems to be very, very, very hard to separate out your pre-existing bias of whether or not you think racism exists or not.
Well, again, we didn't even define what you mean by racism, but let me just a much more practical example.
Yeah.
I'm on a grand rounds, I listen every week to a grand rounds from one of the schools I went to. And they, like many schools now, or our Department of Psychiatry has an anti-racism task force. This was designed by the residents. And they have a series of things they want to see changed. And they just two of them are, there should not be, no disparities, which is a word, it used to be a nice innocent word, and now it means malignant differences between groups. It's almost assumed to mean bad faith. Whenever we see a disparity, it seems to, unfortunately, to have the aura of bad faith surrounding it. And well, maybe it does, but these are heuristics we have to explore. So what they want to do is eliminate disparities between the use of restraints in African-American patients versus white, so maybe it's minorities and white patients, and the use of antipsychotics. And this either or in the emergency room or inpatient wards. And well, I'm not sure I want to eliminate that. I want to study it for sure to see whether there are these differences. And then you want to, that's the beginning. And then you want to understand why. To me, kind of race-based explanations, which should definitely be in a hierarchy of possible answers, although it's rare we find one answer for anything, but is more of a diagnosis of exclusion. It's when you've accounted for so much else. So for example, now this is a hypothetical, but one could easily imagine that, well, we know this is a fact, that African-American patients are, at least in psychiatry, will be sicker by the time they come in for help. And you can speculate why that is. Maybe they haven't been treated well there before, at that particular hospital, whatever the reason. Maybe they don't trust doctors as much, but they come in sicker. If you come in more psychotic, and especially if you come in on PCP, I mean, I work in DC and PCP is just commonly used among, the African-American patients I see, you're going to be out of control. And this is not to say that we don't have other ways of de-escalating folks and calming them down, and those should always be instituted first. No question about that. In fact, this may be a red flag to see whether or not we are instituting these kinds of approaches first. But it wouldn't be out of the question that this is why, unfortunately, we have to go to sort of the last resort, which is physical restraint. No one wants to do that, and no one wants to be in it for sure. But I mean, these are the explanations we have to look at. And what I worry about is, you're saying, Anish, that sometimes it's hard to figure out what accounts for these differences. But I can tell you that we can't jump to racism as the first answer. We could find these differences, and they are then the beginning of the search for what are the explanations. And it could be that a race-related explanation, it figures powerfully. but
why?
it's the beginning.
Yeah, no, it's beautifully said. You've been really far out front on this. I mean, I'm embarrassed to tell you what I was doing in 1998 when you wrote your first book, PCMD. But how is it that we've come to a point, certainly in 2020, and you were there in 1998. How is it that we've come to a point in 2020 where that difference that you're describing is one that breaks down based on politics now? So if you don't choose racism first as an explanation for an outcome difference, you're probably a conservative.
A racist.
Oh yeah, you're a racist because all conservatives are racist.
I mean, of course not. But that, right?
Yeah, no. That's the narrative. I was told that in a text message today.
That's a very good point.
But if you reach for racism as the first example, when you see an outcome difference that breaks down between races, in a way that's not good, of course, and you reach for racism as this is the most likely explanation, that means that you are, that puts you on one side of the spectrum. Is that something, Dr. Satel, that has existed for like a very, very, very long time, or is that something that happened? I mean, you wrote about it in 1998, so it must have been percolating for a while, even in 1998. I kind of awoke to it, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago or something. So,
well, the hostilities wasn't as marked then. The thing is, I think there's a generational difference now in who's in medical schools. I mean, from students to faculty. Clearly, there's always that gradation. The younger generation is always going to obviously be. There's probably always going to be a difference in generational social attitudes, but this is what we see in college. It's the next step, obviously, graduate school after college. And I do think it would be very interesting to do a survey. I wish you guys would, of just looking at, anyone who's in the faculty directory and student directory, medical students, residents, fellows of, several medical schools, and just what year, they were born in, and see what they think about. We could operationalize the concepts we've been talking about. I think you would see a significant generational difference. And I think that you would see some of the more, the older doctors or the faculty who are in that liminal period where they're more senior, but they haven't gotten tenure yet, assuming there's still tenure in medical schools. I don't even know if there is anymore, but they're too afraid to speak out or they're too intimidated. I do think that the majority of, look, anyone who's gotten a PhD, you know how to think logically through a problem. I mean, this is a matter of ideology trumping reason. I mean, one thing that always gives me some consolation is we're still a practice. You still have to deal with people. We still have to help them live. We have to help them get better. Physicists have to, engineers have to build bridges. They can't fall down. Right. Always thought that the schools of the applied sciences were somewhat insulated. And when we see this culture, if and when, and we might not, but if we see this culture starting to have an effect on patient care, then I think people will really have to look up.
But the problem, Dr. Satel, is that folks now see what you wrote, and they don't see what you wrote as something.
They're the ones who speak out. They're the ones who speak out.
Right. No, but how do you rebut them to say that, hey, you're being political by writing what you're writing? So it's no surprise that most of the folks are saying, oh, we should keep politics out of medicine.
I'll tell you how you do that, and
go ahead.
That's where I think it's a great line of discussion here, because Dr. Satel, Sally, you wrote PCMD in 1999 or 1998, but you wrote in 2006 this book that I mentioned at the introduction, The Health Disparities Myth, where you make the point that you just made a moment ago, that the word disparity itself was carefully chosen because they could have used the word difference when they were doing studies in those days between outcomes or the way different races are treated, but they use disparities because of its sort of emotional or intentional connotation, right? And there are lots of this concern about racism is not new. It was there in 2006 when you wrote the book, and even you wrote the book in 2006 reflecting on,
Yeah,
maybe a decade,
1995 was the first.
right. So yet the methodology and the science has changed, meaning the studies that they were using to prove that racism was there and structural, and because they used those terms in those days, they were not as amplified as they are now, but they were present back then. It was different kinds of studies. Back then, it was database exploration of Medicare data sets and whatnot and so forth, and those were debunked, so to speak. I mean, it was clear, and then they came up with a new set of methodology, and then finally the implicit bias. And now you don't even need any method whatsoever, because you can just say that you're racist, and if you deny it, then it's proof that you are, right? So that, to me, if you follow that sort of escalation.
Yeah.
That degradation in the quality of the evidence and in the reasoning, then that means that it's completely ideologically driven, that there's no way to think about these things in sort of rational terms and whatnot. I mean, if it wasn't clear enough, I mean,
True, but the good news is you do have to treat the person in front of you. And
right.
It would be, I mean, this is a questionable work in progress. I mean, other than wasting time, what will the effect of reading Robin DiAngelo be? And intimidating some of the students who might want to question it. Gee, is she really positing a rational framework, for example, if the answer is always racism? I mean, will these be classrooms that are really open to other points of view? But apart from possibly, I mean, I hate to be so negative, but unfortunately, this might introduce a tension between classmates, because some folks probably are a little more politicized than others, and again, taking time away from learning about epidemiology or all other kinds of things. Maybe that's all it's going to do, and if so, that's a shame. But will it really find its way into how we treat patients? I don't know how much. I know you had Amy Wax on before, and I'm like you. I'm eagerly waiting for the rebuttal paper to Dr. Wang's Journal of the American Heart Association. I mean, retraction is bazooka, and I don't know if I simply don't know. It remains to be seen to me whether or not that was way too heavy-handed a response to a paper that might have had some problems, but we'll see.
You're referring to.
But I do worry about the standards being lowered, and then I wonder, well, if people sort themselves out, we'll still have certain people going into getting MD PhDs and other people doing primary care work, where as long as they can refer to specialists, if their real talent is connecting with patients and having them take their diabetes medicine and their asthma meds and watch their diet a bit, because so much of that depends on compliance and a good relationship with the doctor, maybe this will all be fine.
Correct. Let me read a sentence from your paper, because I think it touches on this and it's important. You said, you raised the concern, how can we effectively promote the importance of self-care, following a diet, exercising, taking prescribed medications regularly, under a regime that sees patients as being almost exclusively at the mercy of social forces, right? So now if you have students that are going to see somebody not doing well, and they go, well, it must be because of racism, are they going to serve those patients, those Black or minority patients well?
Yes, I did ask that question. I love that question. I will, but I'll be my own foe here and say it was maybe more rhetorical, because I can't help but think that when you're face to face with a patient, you're just going to have to talk to them about, how they're going to take their medications. I mean, you're just going to have to. And I never realized before how lucky I am as a psychiatrist. That's what we do. All my work, I mean, you're either managing symptoms or you're managing the way people undermine themselves, basically. I mean, 9/10 of psychotherapy is how are you sabotaging yourself in ways you don't even quite realize. And the other half is, I'm so depressed I can't get out of bed, or I hallucinate, where we actually, medications make an enormous difference. And of course, in many cases, it's both. But anything I can do for someone is to help them get a sense of their role in their problem, and what's not their role in their problem. I mean, that's can be very confusing for people, especially depending on the other individuals you live with. And just to sort that out, it can be a major task. But if you think your problem is that you live in a racist society, then don't see me, see a civil rights lawyer. And that's one of the problems that I wrote about in PCMD, is this whole notion of cultural, I can't believe I'm blanking on the name, maybe because I've repressed it, because I find so antithetical to what we do in psychiatry. It's a culturally competent psychiatry, which actually tells patients the reason for your distress is that you live in a racist society. Now, it could well be that your patient really does have a racist boss. Well, let's figure that out. How does he act towards you versus how does he act toward, what kinds of experiments? Brian Nosek could talk all about this. I believe he's a clinician as well. This has a cognitive behavioral dimension to it. How do you test your hypotheses about the way people see you and the way you understand the world? But psychiatrists are the most personalized medicine, most personalized practitioners in all of medicine. And we're the ones, especially if you work with people who have addictions, and that's my area, drug abuse. It's all, 9/10 of it is you. It's how are you going to change your behavior? So I feel in some ways somewhat protected from some of this ideology, because that's what we do, and that's why people come to us. That's a shared assumption that I've got to change something about the way I think and the way I act.
But it's this is great. I mean, very well said. But it's that movement is so relentless. You at the beginning you said that you agreed with 60% of the proposal. The three-pronged proposal. One is to increase diversity to the extent possible in medicine. The second one was to better understand the social determinants of health. That actually triggers me. That the phrase, I must tell you, it triggers me. I wrote a book about the origin of that phrase, the social determinants of health.
Oh.
In fact, the term determinant in it, I mean, as you just mentioned, it should be the social factors, right? But it's the social determinants. So but just today, I received an email from, I don't know why, I'm on the mailing list of Ohio State University Medical Center. And it says here, racism is a social determinant of health. So even if you want to study the social determinants, all your roads lead to racism, and
it's not useful. I mean, basically, it's just not helpful. I mean, what are we going to do about that? How do we break it down? That's why I say almost, can we forget this language, this signaling language, and just talk about what are the problems confronting this person or this group or this neighborhood? Is the transportation so bad that they can't, get to their appointments? I mean, we've got to break it down, or our hands are tied. And you could argue that using all this, I mean, this language and this whole new vocabulary is almost, in and of itself, a distraction. It keeps us from.
We could probably start with the
and what
absurd.
Do patients want? You think patients care about this? I don't. Go
Well,
ahead. I'm sorry, Anish.
Sorry, we could probably start with the absurd. I mean, I think it is hard, because I think regardless of how we come at it, when as soon as we start saying that, this is change that can come within you, and we should avoid these larger issues, pushing, how to pay for transportation, stuff that to the three of us seems relatively straightforward, is outside the sphere of what we should be doing as physicians. I mean, I don't really have expertise in figuring out how to transport people from
that's
XYZ
exactly
to me. Like, so how do I know what exactly to push for?
You don't, but people have to get to you. And
right,
every hospital works with the neighborhood, and then that's how it's translated. So it's knowledge you have that if people have the will get implemented.
Right, but we live in this weird world now where, like, if you think that, then you're a conservative and you're not a progressive.
Well,
but the absurd. I mean, you're decades ahead of certainly.
That's the point, and you're not. You're in the academic. we all have one foot, maybe you have both feet and two hands in that world. But I honestly think that most people are pretty reasonable about this
Yeah,
stuff.
no, well, I meant you're decades ahead in terms of recognizing some of the
Okay, I'll take any
absurdities of
credit
things.
you want to give me.
No. And so some of the things are pretty absurd, and I hope that even though if you can't see things in the moment, these things seem absurd to us, and maybe in 20 years people look back and see one of the things we're doing now is absurd. Well, you've kind of provided that because you wrote in your book PCMD that you were at a 1998 session of the American Public Health Association, and Sally Zierler of Brown University's Department of Community Health declared that AIDS is a biological expression of social inequality. And she recommended that the way to curb the epidemic is to limit the power of corporations, cap salaries of CEOs, eliminate corporate subsidies, prohibit corporate contributions to politicians, and strengthen labor unions. I mean, I'm amazed
that is, but that's not for us to decide. Maybe I don't think so personally, but it's a good debate over how to construct a society. That's not what doctors do. Now, she can lobby for all these things as she's not I don't know if she's a doctor or a PhD, but in any case, she's clearly in this realm. She can lobby for it on her own as a citizen.
Right. But it's so clear that the AIDS epidemic, I mean, this is the problem. The AIDS epidemic ended not because we converted our society to some, more, we didn't seize all private land and then distribute it all in equal parcels, and that's why the AIDS epidemic ended. I mean, and that's what they were selling in 1998. So, I think you, Stanley Goldfarb is another, who's also written pretty strongly about this.
I might go a little farther out than he does, though.
Yeah.
I was just rereading his op-eds now. He's maybe written papers now. I'm embarrassed to say I haven't read longer papers by him. He's very narrow in his interpretation, and I'm a little more sympathetic to him, certainly. I could see having a foot certainly in the policy world. And I thought one of the questions that, comes up is, where do you draw the line? And I certainly don't have a hard and fast prescription.
Yeah.
But I would say that that two things are most important. It would be, if you're going to get involved, certainly a lot of physicians are involved with healthcare delivery.
Yeah.
Understandably, that's what we do. So to me, that's a more within the concentric circle of.
Yeah, I don't think he disagrees. I think he agrees. I'm pretty sure he agrees with you in the sense that, like, as a private citizen, you can have a foot in the door of figuring out how to do X, Y, and Z.
I even meant as a physician, though, to some extent.
Oh, okay.
But I was just going to say that my two variables, I guess, to consider is what I would say is appropriate. Although, of course, you can do anything you want. You're never going to be penalized. People are marching for Black Lives Matter with their white coats and having die-ins in front of their hospitals, and they can do that. But and I understand that it's in good. The sentiment is it's a very benign and sentiment. Of course, they're against racism, but is proximity to healthcare. What Sally's earlier was saying about corporate America, or Dr. Berwick, John Berwick wrote an op-ed recently in JAM about how the electoral doctor should be against the electoral college. I mean, that is just absurdly upstream, or absurdly outside of medicine. So that it fails the test of proximity, to be sure. And then the second test is expertise. What do doctors know about these other things? You just said before, with even the example of the shuttle to the hospital, which is really a health near kind of a project that I'd say made some sense. But then you hand it off to the people who are experts in that. And that's where I think we can kind of think about where a line should be drawn, is when it violates those principles of proximity and expertise. Because when you do violate them, then I strongly believe you really damage public trust in what should be neutral institutions that are
Right. I'm going to disagree with you, Sally. I'm more of a hardliner. I think this proximity test. I mean that's it keeps getting pushed further and further. I mean there's no, because if you go back 20
Yeah.
years, you have the seed of where we are now, and if you go back 20 years before, you have the seed of where they were back then. I mean the whole thing, it's always, and then
I'm sympathetic.
and then the expertise thing, they will tell you, well, it's because you're not an expert. Here we have the curriculum. We're changing the curriculum so that you can be an expert in.
Well, you can't. You can't.
No, but that's why
Right.
I think that's why the best way to make this case is to look historically. I pointed out that which is a complete, now looking back at what Sally Zerler said in 1998, I mean, that seems completely farcical, at least. I mean, look, I get it. I understand that, when you have epidemics like under or whatever epidemic that comes out, clearly the folks that are least affected are the folks in the Hamptons. The folks most affected are the folks living in under questionable circumstances in the inner city. But some of the ridiculous, I mean, the thing that brought the HIV/AIDS epidemic to an end was the system which pays way too much money for AZT, which the New York Times, there were articles about, oh my God, AZT is so expensive. It was like $9,000 for the year or something. I mean, how much would we pay right now for a COVID vaccine or something? But in your specific profession, actually, right, you can make the point really well. I mean, in all of our professions, we can make the point well, but especially in yours, I think, correct? Because you've kind of seen, and you've detailed some of these things in your book in terms of, some of the how one deals with the mentally ill, for instance, correct? Can you talk about some of that, how political correctness and how kind of these movements that were well intended, as kind of social justice movements have really, it's not a debate anymore, but they really hurt people. Can you describe some of that?
Probably one of the most dramatic examples is people with severe mental illness. Until recently, we never really had a director of a federal agency called SAMHSA, Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, which is under HHS. Until Trump, actually, we never had a director who was dedicated to the welfare of severely mentally ill people. And I'm not saying that we should care about them at the expense of people with more moderate illness, and some people with more moderate illness, if they're not, we don't pay attention to them, they could be on their way to severe mental illness. But there was an overt hostility towards medication, towards organized psychiatry, which I did document that in my book, and in fact, it's until recently, is still a very big problem of I know this almost sounds a little black helicopter, but there's like anti-psychiatry movement, which, as I said, is very critical of formal psychiatry and very skeptical of the value of medications, certainly is wildly opposed to involuntary commitment, which again, no one really wants to get to the point of infringing on civil liberties. But if the trade-off is that the person kills themselves or someone else, or freezes in the park, or is so paranoid that they won't feed themselves, then this is an act of benign paternalism, and we do have to intervene. And there are groups that they're small, but they had disproportionate leverage, because people who were part of that movement often found their way into to be directors of mental health in various states. And as I mentioned before, until recently, the last 4 years, the woman who headed SAMHSA was a part of that movement. And so it disproportionately harmed severely mentally ill people. I mean, we can go back to 1959 with the deinstitutionalization movement, which certainly there was an indication for some of that to happen, for sure, especially as we finally started using more Thorazine and other medications that people could live outside of institutions. But that exodus of those hospitals really overshot the mark, because we weren't in a position to absorb these folks in the communities. And now we barely have any hospital beds. And as you know, the jail systems are about 1/3 populated by people with mental illness, and the ranks of the homeless are disproportionately contain them. And it's just a horrible, horrible state of affairs. And that's because there is, I mean, this is one example of political correctness in medicine. In fact, how I define political, I didn't define it in the book, and I should have, but to me, political correctness is an orthodoxy intended to maintain victim status. And the idea is that people who became mentally ill were really, it's a very Langian view, that they were actually responding to oppression of some form. It wasn't racialized back then, but oppression in society.
Right.
And that pursuing this anti-psychiatry movement was a pushback against corporate medicine and I mean, pharmaceutical companies and organized medicine and just paternalism, you know, in general. And which is not to say that we treat everyone as well as we should. I've seen some heavy-handedness that I think is very unfortunate. I think we could give a lot of people a lot more autonomy in deciding their treatment plans and all that kind of stuff. So stipulate these people have points, but their policy recommendations have done enormous damage to severely mentally ill. And may I just add one more plank, another plank in their campaign against psychiatry is that the people with severe mental illness are no more violent than people without it. That's simply not true. Now, when once medicated, then that's more equalized. And to the extent that severely mentally ill people often also use substances, that clearly enhances the propensity for violence. But these, you know, when a severely mentally ill person is homeless, it's not generally the, you know, remember the mantra of Mitch Snyder and the early homeless advocates, homes, 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 or houses, houses, houses. It's not simply housing. You know, that's very important. There's nothing more destabilizing than not having a place to live. It's soul crushing. Right. But you need a social environment. You need often medication. You need so much more. And finally, as I say, because an excellent psychiatrist, I'll give her a shout out, Eleanor McCanns-Katz, is head of SAMHSA. Those kinds of issues are being paid attention to, and the funding to these groups that were actively trying to undermine help for the most severely ill, she's cut them.
It's very important, Sally, what you mentioned here, because I think it speaks to a very deep-seated, very long-standing, for decades, even into the 19th century, a movement that deliberately sought to use medicine for social ends, for re-engineering society, for settling class warfare. I mean, and they tend to be socialistic type sort of impulses. You know, at various times they may be, you know, in some cases they may seem more libertarian on the surface and whatnot, but they're essentially is trying to use medicine or the medical profession to sort of change society and change the way we deal with one another. And what we talked, you know, what you just mentioned, and then what we talked about earlier are just different manifestations of that same thing. And it's, you know, it's taken hold of academia, or in many ways it got its first foothold through the academic process with again, it's my soapbox. I harp against licensing, because the licensing reforms, which are really part of the progressive movement. I mean, the guys who financed the licensing reforms, Flexner, that really gave prominence to academic medicine. You know, before that, medicine was private. I mean, you had private hospitals, private institutions who tried to do the best for their communities and whatnot. And now you have, all of a sudden, you have this prominence given to academia, very infiltrated by these sort of socialistic ideas, the Flexner report was bankrolled by the Carnegie Foundation. If you look back at who was heading the Carnegie Foundation in those days, it was people who really believed in John Dewey's reforms of education to really reshape society. So all these things are very important. We need to be aware of. I mean, I want, if I was head of the curriculum, I have students study that sort of thing, trying to understand exactly the social forces that are shaping that have shaped the curriculum over the last 100
and yet
years.
The irony is, oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's it. I'm down from my soapbox. Yeah.
Also such an irony that now in COVID, people are seeing acute medicine at its most acute and at its most dedicated in terms of the practitioners. And I don't know, I listened to this webcast, TWIV, This Week in Virology. It's fantastic. On Sundays, it's very technical, usually PhDs, but on Sunday they have a clinician who goes over all the I mean, the level of sophistication and excellence and being brought to bear on this issue, which I understand from an article I saw recently, has inspired even more people to apply to medical schools, is medicine at its best.
Mm-hmm.
And can't be throwing around loose terms and rushing to call things racism when you have someone on a ventilator and you have to know how to balance the medications and the acid base, and it's difficult. And I hope people are absorbing that, just how rigorous and how serious and how sensitive managing these folks is.
Yes, correct. And it's people behaving, out of their own impulse, or their own natural and good biases to do what's right for the patient, the patient who's suffering.
Now that's the kind of that's enormous selflessness, which
right.
I mean, goes a very, very long way, and you don't have to virtue signal that, you're doing it.
Sally, you've been very generous with your time. This has been fantastic. I discovered your writing recently, just, from the kerfuffle with John Mandrola. I'm very happy that, a good outcome is that I learned about you. I've read your books. I've gotten the latest one. I haven't read it yet on titled Brainwashed, but it sounds fascinating. So perhaps we'll have you back to talk about some of these issues. And thank you very much. Can you tell us where people can follow you?
Yeah, because I want as much blowback as John got. At SLSATEL, so, Twitter, SLSATEL. And then I have a website called SallySatelMD.com.
Very good. And we'll have those, of course, on the show notes, as well as the link to the article and a link to your book and all of that. Sally, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you.